So it's Friday, September 2nd, and I'm going to try to answer the question of why Russians still support the war. So I'm going to go through the daily events through the news, as I always do, and I'm going to answer that particular question because that's what's really important today. I'm going to start with the British intelligence update. And so the British put this out every day, and they just said some really interesting things that I want to highlight. So despite the war in Ukraine on September 1st, the Russian military started exercises Vostok 22, its joint strategic exercise marking the culmination of the military training year. Russia publicly claimed that 50,000 troops will take part. I saw that on the news last night. I thought, wow, that's a lot to be committing to this training exercise out in the east when this is what's going on in Ukraine. It's unlikely that more than 15,000 personnel will be actively involved this year. This is around 20% of the forces which participated last year or in 2018. Russia's military performance in Ukraine has highlighted the fact that Russia's military strategic exercises, such as Vostok, have failed to sustain the military's ability to conduct large-scale, complex operations. We've seen that writ large in Ukraine. But this was the real kicker for me. This last line: such events are heavily scripted, do not encourage initiative, and primarily aim to impress Russian leaders and international audiences and the Russian public. Now, this rang true to me because I've heard this before when there was military analysis talking about why the Russians were not succeeding on the ground was because these kind of exercises are all very scripted. And you can do the scripted thing again and again, but when it all goes sideways, as it has in Ukraine, this scripted thing doesn't really help. It's impressive to demonstrate, look at, we have a show of force, but it's not impressive in battle. Okay, so here's my main point for today, and that is Russian independent polling organization Levada posted a survey results on September 1 indicating that while the majority of Russians still support military operations, support may be gradually declining. The point is gradual. 76% of the survey's respondents are in favor of Russian forces in Ukraine. These are Russians being surveyed. 76%. 3 out of 4 Russians support the war in Ukraine. 46% strongly support and 30% generally supporting. 48% of respondents believe that it's necessary for Russian operations to keep going in Ukraine. Why? Because they keep getting fed Pravda and RT and TASS saying how important it is that these aggressors be pummeled, and look, they're being pummeled, and look, this offensive is failing. Now, this is down. Levada found that 53% of respondents strongly support Russian military actions in March, right? Now that's down to 44% that were in favor, 48%. So it's down a little bit, but it's still pretty enthusiastic. Now why? Well, because they keep reading articles like this in Pravda. Armed forces of Ukraine lose 97 tanks in just 3 days. Well, one, let's say that is true. We're not showing how many tanks the Russians are losing, but you get stuff like this. These are gems. During the unsuccessful offensive of Ukrainian troops in the Kherson region, the armed forces of Ukraine suffered heavy losses. From the period of August 30 to September 1, the total losses of the armed forces reached 97 tanks, which is equal to 3 tank battalions. The massive losses of our armed forces of Ukraine stopped the offensive operations to avoid even more losses. Really? They haven't stopped, but they're saying that they have. Kyiv does not officially comment on the losses of almost 100 tanks, about 200 military personnel during the failed offensive. So if you're reading this and you're Russian, and this is all you're getting to read because it's blocked from Western news outlets, well, I mean, you might think this is going okay. Okay, here's an article from The Guardian. The push to Kherson is a symbol of, and this is a pretty reasonably balanced article. He's talking about an advisor to President Zelensky talked about how there's no quick wins. The officials in Ukraine said that they had pushed back the Russian defenders in several places, but insisted it was too soon to name villages or places where it is. This is not a blitzkrieg. It's definitely not. The occupiers' troop numbers west of the vast river have gone up from a few thousand to about 20,000. So where are we talking about? Here's Kherson. Here is the Endohar, somewhere around here is the nuclear power plant. Odessa is down here. This northern area above the river, 20,000 Russian troops in this little slice alone. And that's where the offensive is. These green lines, that's what the Ukrainians, and that's what this is the battle. And so, yeah, there's a lot of troops there, and it just depends on how long each side is willing to fight. So it's gone up from a few thousand to about 20,000. Now, the bridges are blown, so they can't really go anywhere. So it's going to be kind of a slugfest. It's obvious what the stakes are. If Russia can hold on, the Kremlin will feel like it's in a strong place to consolidate all the gains that it's made across Ukraine and enforce Russification and sham referendums. And I think that that's right. If it goes sideways for Ukraine, it's going to be very bad. If it goes the way Ukraine intends, it's going to be bad for Russia. Okay. Other news. Russian energy company Gazprom announces that the Nord Stream Pipeline 1 will not restart on schedule, and Europeans are crying foul, saying, hey, look, this is just energy warfare. Well, I mean, they kind of want it both ways. They kind of want to punish the Russians, and they kind of want their energy at the same time. It's kind of a weird thing to watch. Here is an article related to. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's talk about this first. Rafael Grossi, who returned from his first visit to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, said 6 of the team's experts remained at the site, and he's going to produce a report. But there's clear that there are military operations around which worry him. Now, the Ukrainians say that the Russians have moved military equipment, so there's no military equipment to be found because they've moved the military equipment away from there. The Russians say, see, Russia had no heavy weapons on there. You don't see them. Well, maybe they moved them, maybe they didn't. We don't know. But let's say that they moved them. Well, Shogi dismissed as blatant lies Ukrainian claims that Russia was using the facility to attack Ukrainian positions with long-range artillery systems. I state with confidence that we do not have any heavy weapons at the territory of the nuclear power. Well, he doesn't have an issue with lying, but 2, he's stating this in the present, not in the past. I hope members of the IAEA inspection will confirm it with their own eyes. Well, it would have been a little bit more believable had you let them in 3 weeks ago, but since you delayed, and that was plenty of time to move stuff, it's a little harder to believe. G7 countries agree on a plan to impose price cap on Russian oil. Okay, so G7's a little late to the party on this. So they've agreed to impose a price cap on Russian oil. This is the G7, UK, US, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada. They agreed to put a ceiling on. So the way that oil works is like there's a cartel. They agree that they're not going to sell for more than a certain amount. All the oil producers like OPEC and whatever, we're not going to sell for except for at this rate. Well, if all the customers say, well, we're not going to buy except for at this rate, at this lower rate, well, then they're going to have to lower it or not sell it. So that's if a cartel can hold together, and that's the question. The G7 is not a big enough cartel for this to happen, in my opinion. Okay, so the cap is expected to be introduced on December 5th for crude and 5 February for refined products. Like, why didn't you do this 6 months ago? If you did this 6 months ago, you would have starved the Russians while they weren't already selling to India and China, and they were selling primarily to Europe. Had you done this 6 months ago, it would have had a tremendous effect. So it's a little bit too little too late. Kremlin Dmitry Peskov, I think, rightly said companies that impose a price cap will not be among the recipients of Russian oil. He doesn't have to. He's going to sell to India. He's going to sell to Africa. He's going to sell to China now. And they've already established those trading lines where, again, 6 months ago, this would have been effective. The effectiveness of this will come down to the enforcement, not just in the G7, but in other markets. In theory, more countries may come on board if they can access cheap oil. I don't know if that's going to actually happen. Another article here is Pravda, the G7 to bite the hand that feeds Europe by capping oil prices. Another article, G7 unveils a plan to enforce Russian oil cap, and it's just rehashing the same stuff that we just talked about. Moscow made it clear that it would not comply, instead shipping its crude to countries not bound by the cap. That's what's going to happen in my estimation. Okay, again, but if you look at the framing of this is why I'm saying seven. So as you watch these and you watch the Western news and then Russian news, you're seeing why Russians are supporting, because like they look at this and go, well, so what? We'll just sell our oil to other places, and that's the way it's framed. And I think that's probably actually what's going to happen. And so Russians are still on board mentally, like they're not seeing the downside of what's happening to their brother Russians in Ukraine. Like that's how they see Russia, as there's not a distinction. There is a distinction, but they're not seeing that distinction. They're just seeing the upside of things. Oh, well, you don't want to buy your oil? Well, we'll sell it somewhere else. Oh, well, there's really no heavy weapons there. Okay, so it's all those kind of things. I'm going to finish with this last article. The U.S. violates a UN agreement. It says Moscow. The U.S. has neglected its obligations. Now, what UN agreement has the U.S. violated? Well, they're not granting certain passports to a few Russian members of a delegation, and they're all up in arms about this. But they're not all up in arms about rolling 150,000 soldiers across the border of a sovereign nation next door that they had promised in 1995 or so to, hold the borders inviolate for the sacrifice of the nuclear weapons that Ukraine had. So, they're not okay, or they don't mind going past the the Budapest Memorandum and ignoring that and rolling tanks over the border. But the U.S. isn't allowing a couple of their delegation to get passports, and that's bad. Okay. Anyway, that's the news for today. I hope that helps you understand why. Yesterday we were talking about just, I said watch Russian state news, and I said do that so you can get into their mindset. Well, here I want you to understand why Russians still support this war. They're not just being mean, they're being misled, intentionally misled. Now, they should be thinking more, like if they were watching Western news like I'm telling you to watch Russian news, it would be a very different picture. So, okay, at any rate, that's it. That's all that I have for today. Thank you for caring enough to be at this point that you've watched this, and I'll see you tomorrow.